A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
If you were standing outside the Condab facility in central Iran early this morning, the first thing you would have noticed was the silence. For months, that site has been a hive of activity, with construction crews working around the clock to rebuild what was damaged last year. But as of today, March 27th, 2026, that silence is back, punctuated only by the smell of scorched concrete and the distant hum of Israeli drones.
It is a heavy silence, Corn, quite literally. I am Herman Poppleberry, and I have spent the last several hours poring over the technical specifications of the Arak reactor and the satellite imagery coming out of the region. The Israeli Defense Forces confirmed earlier today that they carried out targeted, high-precision strikes on the Arak heavy water reactor and the Ardakan yellowcake plant. This is not just another skirmish. It is a surgical removal of a very specific type of nuclear capability.
Usually, when people hear the words nuclear and strikes in the same sentence, they think of the end of the world. But the IDF was very clear that these were conventional strikes on nuclear infrastructure. Their stated goal was to stop what they called repeated reconstruction attempts, and in a move that feels almost surreal, they even sent out evacuation warnings first. It is like a polite way of saying, we are about to blow up your multi-billion-dollar hardware, so please step outside for a moment.
That is the nature of modern kinetic diplomacy. The IDF stated the goal was to prevent the restoration of plutonium production capabilities. To understand why Arak is such a massive target, and why the IDF is willing to risk a regional escalation to hit it, you have to understand the chemistry of the water itself. Most people think of water as just H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom. But heavy water, or deuterium oxide, is a different beast entirely because of a single subatomic particle.
I remember this from high school chemistry, though I was mostly focused on how to make things change color or smoke. Deuterium is basically hydrogen that went to the gym and put on some muscle, right?
That is actually a very apt metaphor. A standard hydrogen atom is the simplest thing in the universe, 1 proton and 1 electron, no neutrons. But deuterium has 1 proton and 1 neutron in its nucleus. That extra neutron makes it roughly 10% denser than regular water. If you had a gallon of heavy water in one hand and a gallon of regular water in the other, you would actually feel the difference. It looks the same, it tastes the same, but the physics inside are completely different.
And this is where we get into the term moderator. I always pictured a moderator as someone at a debate trying to keep people from shouting over each other. But in a nuclear reactor, it is doing something much more literal with the speed of the particles.
When a uranium atom splits, it releases neutrons, but those neutrons are moving way too fast. We call them fast neutrons. They are like bullets zipping through the air. If they are moving that fast, they are likely to just fly right past other uranium atoms without causing them to split. To keep a chain reaction going, you need to slow those neutrons down so they can be captured by the fuel. That process is called moderation. You are essentially putting the brakes on the neutrons so they can do their job.
So regular water can do that too, right? Most of the power plants in the United States are light water reactors. Why is heavy water the boogeyman in the context of Iran's program?
This is the crucial distinction that everyone needs to grasp. Light water is a good moderator, but it has a major downside. It is a neutron hog. It loves to eat neutrons. It absorbs them. Because regular water absorbs so many neutrons, you cannot use natural uranium as fuel. There simply would not be enough neutrons left over to keep the reaction alive. To use light water, you have to enrich the uranium to increase the concentration of the isotope uranium-235. You are essentially packing the fuel with more reactive material to overcome the ones the water is stealing.
Right, and enrichment is the hard part. That is the thousands of centrifuges spinning at supersonic speeds in places like Natanz or Fordo. That is a massive industrial headache that is very hard to hide.
Precisely. But heavy water does not absorb neutrons nearly as well as light water does. Because it is so efficient at slowing neutrons down without capturing them, you can sustain a chain reaction using natural, unenriched uranium. You can literally pull uranium ore out of the ground, process it into yellowcake at a place like the Ardakan facility, and put it straight into a heavy water reactor. You bypass the entire enrichment cycle.
So if you have a heavy water reactor, you have a shortcut. You do not need the massive centrifuge halls that the intelligence agencies are always looking for. You just need the reactor and a source of natural uranium.
It is often called the second path to the bomb. The first path is uranium enrichment, which we have talked about in the past, like back in episode 509. But the second path is plutonium breeding. When you run a heavy water reactor like the IR-40 at Arak, the natural uranium inside, which is mostly uranium-238, absorbs some of those slowed down neutrons and transforms into plutonium-239.
And plutonium-239 is the good stuff if you are trying to build a warhead. It is actually more efficient than uranium in many ways because you need a smaller mass of it to reach a critical state.
That is the technical reality. The design capacity for the Arak reactor was roughly 9 to 10 kilograms of plutonium per year. To give the listeners some context, you only need about 5 or 6 kilograms for a sophisticated nuclear weapon. So, this one facility, if fully operational, could produce enough material for 2 nuclear bombs every single year. And unlike an enrichment plant, which you can throttle up or down, a plutonium reactor is a bit more binary. Once it is on and the fuel is being irradiated, the clock is ticking.
That explains why the IDF is so focused on it. We saw a major conflict back in June 2025 where these sites were hit, but today's news is about Iran trying to rebuild. It is like a game of whack-a-mole, except the mole has a nuclear core, and the mallet is a precision-guided munition.
The IDF specifically mentioned the reconstruction of the Calandria in their statement today. For those who do not spend their weekends reading reactor blueprints, the Calandria is the heart of the reactor. It is essentially a large stainless steel tank that holds the heavy water and has hundreds of tubes running through it where the fuel rods go. It is a masterpiece of engineering, and it is incredibly difficult to manufacture.
Back in 2015, as part of the original nuclear deal, the plan was to fill that core with concrete or redesign it so it could not produce weapons-grade plutonium. But the reports coming out now suggest that redesign was either a front or was being actively reverted.
That aligns with what we have seen from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Director General Rafael Grossi has been sounding the alarm for a while now. The agency has not had structured access to Arak since May 2025. When you lose oversight of a dual-use facility like this, the international community has to assume the worst-case scenario. If the inspectors are not allowed to see the Calandria, you have to assume they are building the weapons-capable version.
It is interesting that the Ardakan plant was hit at the same time. If Arak is the oven, Ardakan is the place making the dough. You mentioned yellowcake earlier. That is the concentrated uranium oxide, right?
Yes, it is the intermediate step between raw ore and reactor fuel. By hitting both sites, the IDF is not just breaking the machine, they are cutting off the supply chain. If you destroy the yellowcake production, even if the reactor was somehow left standing, they would have nothing to put in it. It is a comprehensive approach to dismantling the entire plutonium ecosystem.
I find it wild that we are talking about this on March 27th, 2026, and it feels like a repeat of history. We have covered the physics of proliferation before, but the technical reality of how close they are to a breakout is what makes today different. Herman, you mentioned breakout time. How does Arak change that math compared to the centrifuges?
Breakout time is the key metric. With enrichment, we look at centrifuge counts and enrichment percentages. It is a sliding scale. But with a plutonium reactor, once you have the fuel rods in and the heavy water circulating, you are essentially cooking your plutonium. After a certain amount of time, you pull the rods out, chemically separate the plutonium, and you have your bomb material. It is a much more discrete process. If Arak were to go fully online, Iran's breakout time for a plutonium-based weapon would drop from years to months.
You mentioned that heavy water is 10% denser. Does that make it harder to handle? I assume you cannot just buy this at the grocery store next to the distilled water.
It is incredibly expensive and energy intensive to produce. You have to separate it from regular water through a series of chemical exchanges or electrolysis. In regular water, only about 1 in every 6,400 hydrogen atoms is deuterium, so you have to process massive amounts of water to get a usable quantity. That is why the production plant at Arak is so large. It is not just about the reactor, it is about the facility that creates the moderator itself.
So if you lose your supply of heavy water, your reactor is just a very expensive collection of metal pipes. It cannot function without that specific moderator.
And the IDF strikes today were reportedly done in 2 phases. The first phase likely targeted the infrastructure surrounding the reactor, the cooling systems, the power supply, the heavy water storage. The second phase went for the core components, the calandria itself. Iranian state media is saying there were no radiation leaks, which makes sense because the reactor was not currently active with fuel. If it were active, a strike would be a much messier, more dangerous proposition.
That seems like a very deliberate choice by Israel. Hit it while it is being rebuilt, before the fuel is loaded, to avoid a regional environmental disaster while still achieving the strategic goal of resetting the clock. It is a high-stakes calculation, but it is one they have made before.
It is a calculation that Defense Minister Israel Katz has been very vocal about. The strategic implication here is that the diplomatic route, which the International Atomic Energy Agency has been trying to navigate, is effectively stalled. When Rafael Grossi says there is no structured program but the dual-use nature remains a threat, that is diplomatic speak for we are flying blind. And when you are flying blind, the military option becomes the only one left on the table for the IDF.
I am curious about the physics of the strike itself. We have talked about bunker busters in the past, like the massive ordnance penetrator we discussed in episode 694. Did they need that kind of power for Arak?
Arak is not as deeply buried as some of the enrichment sites like Fordow. Fordow is built into a mountain, which is why it is so hard to hit. Arak is more of a traditional industrial site above ground, though it certainly has reinforced containment. The challenge is not just hitting it, but hitting it with enough precision to destroy the calandria without causing collateral damage to the surrounding area. It is like trying to break the engine of a car without scratching the paint on the house next door. Only the car is a nuclear reactor and the house is a neighboring city.
The technical precision involved in modern munitions is what makes this possible. The fact that there were no reported casualties suggests that the evacuation warnings were effective and the targeting was spot on. They are sending a message that they can reach out and touch these specific components whenever they want.
And it is a message that resonates throughout the supply chain. What happens to the heavy water itself if the tanks are ruptured? Does it just evaporate or soak into the ground? Is it toxic?
That is a great question. Deuterium is not radioactive in itself. It is a stable isotope. You could technically drink a glass of heavy water and you would be fine. Although if you replaced a large percentage of the water in your body with it, it would eventually interfere with your metabolic processes because the chemical bonds are slightly stronger. But in terms of an environmental disaster, spilled heavy water is not like a radioactive leak. The danger only comes if the reactor has been running and the water has become contaminated with tritium or other fission products.
So it is the least dangerous part of the reactor to spill, but the most expensive part to replace. That sounds like a very efficient way to sabotage a program. It is a massive setback for the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization. They have invested billions into the Arak site. By forcing them to start over on the calandria and the heavy water production, you are effectively adding years to their plutonium timeline.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions people have is that all nuclear reactors are the same. You see a cooling tower and you think it is all one thing. But this distinction between light water for power and heavy water for breeding is really the core of the whole geopolitical struggle in the region.
You are right to point that out. Iran has a light water reactor at Bushehr that is used for electricity. The international community generally does not have an issue with that one because it is monitored and uses enriched fuel provided by Russia, which then takes the spent fuel back. It is a closed loop that is very hard to divert for weapons. But Arak is an open loop. You put in your own natural uranium, you run the reactor, and you get plutonium out the other side. You do not need anyone else's help once the facility is built.
That self-sufficiency is exactly what makes it a proliferation risk. It is also why the Ardakan yellowcake plant is so vital. If you have your own mines and your own processing, you are outside the reach of international sanctions on fuel supply. You are building a sovereign nuclear weapons cycle.
It feels like we are in this new era of kinetic diplomacy. The talks in Vienna or wherever they are meeting this week seem almost irrelevant when the reality on the ground is being decided by airstrikes. It is a shift from monitoring to disruption. For years, the strategy was to watch and report. But as we saw in the June 2025 war, and again today, the tolerance for just watching has evaporated. The IDF is operating on the principle that once the capability is there, the intent can change overnight.
Let's talk about the takeaways for people trying to make sense of the headlines today. First, heavy water is not for enrichment. That is the big one. If you see a headline saying heavy water is being used to enrich uranium, you can safely assume the author does not know their isotopes.
That is the most common error. Heavy water is a moderator for a reactor. Enrichment happens in centrifuges. They are two completely different industrial processes that lead to two different types of bombs. Uranium bombs use highly enriched uranium. Plutonium bombs use material bred in reactors like Arak.
The second takeaway is that these strikes are about timelines. The IDF is not saying they have destroyed Iran's nuclear ambitions forever. They are saying they have pushed the breakout date further into the future. It is a tactical reset.
And the third takeaway is the importance of the upstream supply chain. You cannot look at the reactor in isolation. The strike on the Ardakan yellowcake plant is just as important because it stops the production of the fuel itself. Without yellowcake, the reactor is just a very expensive monument to engineering.
I also think it is worth noting the role of the International Atomic Energy Agency here. They are in a tough spot. They are supposed to be the world's nuclear watchdog, but if they are being denied access, they are basically a watchdog with a muzzle and a blindfold. Rafael Grossi has been very clear about that. When the inspectors are kicked out or their cameras are turned off, the agency loses its ability to provide the world with any kind of certainty. That lack of certainty is what creates the vacuum that military action eventually fills.
It is a fascinating intersection of very high-level physics and very gritty, real-world conflict. I mean, the idea that a single neutron in a hydrogen atom can change the entire security landscape of the Middle East is just mind-blowing. It is the power of the small. The difference between a hydrogen atom that absorbs a neutron and one that does not is the difference between a power plant and a weapons program. It is one of those areas where the science is so precise that there is no room for ambiguity.
Well, Herman, I think you have successfully explained why water can be heavy, and why that makes people very nervous. I still think it is a bit cheeky of the IDF to send out evacuation warnings, but I suppose if you are going to blow up a multi-billion-dollar facility, you might as well be a gentleman about it.
It is a way to maintain the moral high ground while achieving a devastating strategic result. By avoiding casualties, they make it much harder for the international community to condemn the strikes as a human rights violation. It keeps the focus entirely on the nuclear issue, and it keeps the pressure on the Iranian leadership. They have to explain to their people why these massive investments keep turning into piles of rubble every few months.
The reconstruction of Arak was a major point of national pride for them. Seeing it hit again on March 27, 2026, especially after the damage it took last year, is a massive psychological blow, as well as a technical one. It raises the question, can a country ever truly prove a reactor is for energy only when the physics of its design are so perfectly suited for weapons?
That is the dual-use dilemma. In a heavy water reactor, the line between peaceful research and plutonium factory is paper thin. It relies entirely on trust and transparency, two things that are in very short supply right now.
We should probably wrap this up before I start trying to calculate the neutron cross-section of my coffee. If you want to dive deeper into the history of this, I really recommend checking out episode 716, where we talked about the tactical side of these precision strikes. It really helps put today's news in context.
That one covers the physics of the munitions themselves, which is the perfect companion to the reactor physics we talked about today. It is a complex puzzle, and you really need both pieces to see the full picture. For anyone who wants to follow the updates from the International Atomic Energy Agency, they usually post their reports on their official website. It is worth keeping an eye on Rafael Grossi's statements over the next few days to see how the agency responds to these strikes.
I suspect we will be seeing a lot more from them soon. This is a major shift in the status quo, and the international response is going to be very telling. Well, this has been another deep dive into the weird and often terrifying world of nuclear proliferation. Thanks for sticking with us as we tried to make sense of today's headlines.
It is always a pleasure to break down these topics. There is a certain beauty in the physics, even when the applications are so fraught with tension.
Spoken like a true nerd, Herman. I will stick to the cheeky observations and let you handle the isotopes. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the show running smoothly behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. We literally could not do this without that kind of compute power.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you enjoyed this episode, a quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who might be interested in why some water is heavier than others.
You can find us at myweirdprompts.com for our full archive and all the ways to subscribe to the show.
We are also on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops. Just search for My Weird Prompts.
Until next time, stay curious and keep asking those weird questions.
See ya. Yeah.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.